Activate the disposal unit.
Have you ever watched a classic film and thought you spotted a mistake, a blooper that shouldn't have made it to the screen? Well, what if we told you that one of the most famous errors in Forbidden Planet from 1956 wasn't a mistake at all? For decades, viewers have paused, rewound, and debated this scene, assuming it was a slip-up by the filmmakers. But there's a lot more going on than meets the eye. Curious to know why this scene has been misunderstood for nearly 70 years? Join us as we break down the truth behind the blooper, uncover what was really filmed, and reveal why this moment is far more important than anyone ever realized. The fake mistake. The idea that Forbidden Planet contains a famous blooper has survived for decades because the movie appears to break its own logic. A calm, obedient tiger suddenly attacks. A character's behavior changes without explanation. To modern viewers, this looks like sloppy editing or a missed continuity fix. The assumption is simple. Someone made a mistake and never caught it. But that belief comes from misunderstanding how films were controlled in the 1950s. Today, audiences are used to director's cuts, deleted scenes, and bonus features. When something feels incomplete, we assume it's a technical problem. In the 1950s, it was usually the opposite. Films were often changed after they were finished to satisfy censors, studios, or international markets. Scenes were removed not because they failed, but because they worked too well. When those scenes disappeared, the story was left with gaps that were never meant to exist. It's important to separate three things that often get confused. A production mistake is an error made during filming, like a prop changing positions. A censorship edit is when a completed scene is removed because it breaks moral rules. A deliberate symbolic omission happens when meaning is left unsaid on purpose, often to sneak ideas past authority. Forbidden Planet suffered from all three being mistaken for one another. The film is especially vulnerable to misreading because it blends psychology, desirability, and symbolism beneath a clean science fiction surface. When censorship stripped away key explanations, the remaining moments felt strange instead of meaningful. Watching a heavily censored 1950s film with modern expectations can turn careful storytelling into something that looks careless. And once you see that, the blooper stops looking like an accident and starts looking like a clue to something deeper coming next. Hollywood's big gamble. When MGM approved Forbidden Planet, it wasn't treating the film like a throwaway science fiction project. In 1956, most sci-fi movies were made quickly and cheaply, often for under $500,000. Forbidden Planet was different. MGM spent close to $2 million on it, a shocking amount for the genre at the time. That kind of budget came with pressure. The studio wasn't just hoping the film would work. It needed it to work. MGM's goal was to raise science fiction's reputation. They wanted to prove that stories set in space could look serious, intelligent, and expensive. That meant high-quality sets, careful performances, and controlled storytelling. Nothing was rushed. Scenes were planned, rehearsed, and reviewed repeatedly. When that much money is on the line, studios do not accept carelessness. Every frame of the film passed through multiple layers of control. First came the Production Code Administration, which reviewed scripts and scenes for moral concerns. Then studio executives watched cuts closely, tracking pacing, clarity, and tone. On top of that, MGM had to think about international censors in different countries, each with its own rules. A scene could be approved in one place and rejected in another, forcing changes that had nothing to do with storytelling quality. Because of this intense supervision, continuity errors were rare in prestige productions like Forbidden Planet. When something felt off, it was usually the result of removal, not neglect. Scenes were cut cleanly, sometimes too cleanly, leaving behind moments that now feel confusing. When you understand how tightly controlled this production was, the idea of a random or careless blooper starts to fall apart. What looks like a mistake today was far more likely a deliberate cut made under pressure. And once you realize that, the next missing piece starts to feel a lot more intentional than accidental. The lost scene. There was once a short scene in Forbidden Planet that quietly explained one of the strangest moments in the entire film. It didn't involve action or special effects. It was just a few lines of dialogue, but those lines connected innocence, power, and danger in a way Hollywood was not ready to face in 1956. In the missing scene, Dr. Ostro observes Altera and her pet tiger. He refers to an old belief that only a virgin could tame a unicorn. He then suggests that Altera's calm control over a full-grown tiger comes from the same kind of purity. The idea is clear and spoken out loud. Her innocence gives her a kind of natural authority. The tiger is not trained through fear or force. It obeys her because of what she represents. This idea comes from very old symbolic traditions. Virginity was often linked to purity, restraint, and spiritual power. Animals, especially wild ones, were believed to sense this and respond to it. When an animal submitted, it wasn't because it was weak, it was because something had changed the balance between humans and nature. Mythological purity was never just about morality. It was about control, order, and the absence of desire. That is exactly why the production code stepped in. The dialogue never mentions sex directly, but the meaning is unmistakable. The scene suggests that a woman has power, and that power can be lost. The moment innocence ends, control ends too. For 1950s Hollywood, that implication crossed a line. It tied desirability to behavior, danger, and consequence without using any forbidden words. That made it more threatening, not less. By cutting the scene, the censors believed they were removing something inappropriate. What they actually removed was context. Without the explanation, Altera appears simply gentle and sheltered. With the scene intact, she becomes something much more complex. Her innocence is not just a character trait. It is an active force that shapes the world around her. When the explanation disappeared, so did the meaning behind later events. The tiger's sudden attack no longer had a cause. Altera's emotional shift felt sudden instead of inevitable. What was once a clear psychological progression became a confusing moment that viewers later labeled a mistake. Audiences lost more than a line of dialogue. They lost the key to understanding Altera's role in the story. She was never meant to be just a passive figure on an alien world. She was part of the film's deeper argument about knowledge, desire, and the cost of crossing certain boundaries. And once that missing scene is understood, the next strange moment in the film starts to make a lot more sense. Tiger Attack Mystery. In the version of Forbidden Planet most people have seen, the tiger scene feels confusing. Earlier in the film, the animal is calm and obedient around Altera. It lies beside her without fear and responds to her touch as if it trusts her completely. Then, after she shares her first kiss with Commander Adams, the tiger suddenly attacks her. There is no warning and no explanation. To many viewers, this moment looks like a mistake in the story, or a sudden change that was never properly set up. That confusion exists because the cause of the attack was removed. In the theatrical cut, the audience is never told why Altera had such control over the animal in the first place. Without that knowledge, the tiger's violence feels random. It seems like the film breaks its own rules. But originally, the story followed clear cause and effect logic. The deleted scene explained that Altera's innocence gave her power over the tiger. That power was not emotional or moral. It was symbolic and psychological. The animal responded to a state of being that had not yet been disturbed. Once Altera experienced romantic awakening through the kiss, that state changed. The tiger sensed the change immediately. What looked like sudden violence was actually a response to a loss of control. This idea has deep roots in medieval unicorn lore. In those stories, a unicorn could only be approached or calmed by a virgin. The moment that innocence was gone, the bond was broken. Forbidden Planet borrowed this belief without dressing it up as fantasy. The tiger plays the same role. It is not a random threat. It is a living indicator of transformation. The kiss between Altera and Adams is often remembered as a sweet or awkward romantic moment. In the full version of the story, it is something else entirely. It is the trigger. It marks the point where innocence ends and awareness begins. The film treats this change seriously, not as a celebration, but as a shift with consequences. That is why the attack happens immediately after. This is also why innocence in the film is not presented as a moral virtue. It is a fragile condition. Once changed, it cannot be restored. The tiger does not turn violent because Altera has done something wrong. It reacts because the balance that once existed is gone. By removing the scene that explained this logic, censorship broke the connection between action and meaning. What was once a carefully constructed psychological moment became a confusing event. Viewers were left to assume the film made a mistake, when, in fact, the mistake was removing the explanation. Given how tightly controlled this production was, the idea of a random or careless blooper starts to fall apart. What looks like a mistake today was far more likely a deliberate cut made under pressure. And with that missing link exposed, the film's deeper patterns start to come into focus in the next revelation. Secrets in print. For years, there was no visual proof that Forbidden Planet had ever contained the missing explanation for the tiger scene. All that existed was a strange detail in the official novelization. That book, written by Philip MacDonald under the name W.J. Stewart, was released in 1956 before the movie reached theaters. At the time, this was common. Studios used novelizations to build interest and lock in story details while final edits were still being made to the film. Because the book was based on an early version of the script, it included material that did not survive censorship. One of those moments was the unicorn line. The dialogue appeared clearly and directly, explaining that Altera's innocence gave her control over the tiger. The wording matched what was later found in film materials almost exactly. There was no hint that it was symbolic or poetic. It was treated as a straightforward explanation. Readers at the time didn't think much of it. Many assumed the author had added his own ideas to make the story richer. Novelizations often took creative liberties, so there was no reason to believe this detail came from a filmed scene. Without evidence on screen, the passage was easy to dismiss. What made the situation more complicated was MGM's strict policy on work prints. Once a final cut of a film was approved, all alternate versions were supposed to be destroyed. Studios feared that unfinished edits could confuse audiences, weaken control over a movie's image, or cause problems with censors. Different versions of the same story were seen as a risk, not a resource. For decades, that policy appeared to have worked. Then, in 1977, an old work print of Forbidden Planet surfaced in an archive. No one knows exactly why it survived. It may have been misplaced or simply forgotten. What mattered was what it contained. The print included alternate takes, raw dialogue, and scenes that had been removed before release. Among them was the missing explanation tied to Altera, innocence, and the tiger. Seeing the footage changed everything. The novelization was no longer a questionable source. It was confirmed as accurate. What many had assumed was an author's invention turned out to be a deliberate part of the original film. When the work print was restored and later included in special releases, viewers finally understood why certain moments felt incomplete. The story's logic became clear. Characters' actions made sense again. The film wasn't flawed. It had been altered. That restoration permanently changed how Forbidden Planet was read and discussed. It proved that the truth had always been there, quietly surviving in the places censorship overlooked. And once that door was opened, even more hidden choices began to demand a closer look. Fabricated scandal. One of the biggest controversies surrounding Forbidden Planet came from a scene that showed almost nothing at all. In the swimming sequence, Altera floats alone underwater, moving slowly and calmly. Her body looks uncovered, smooth, and natural. For audiences in 1956, this was shocking. Rumors spread almost immediately that Anne Francis had appeared nude in a major studio film. The reaction was fast and emotional. Letters were written, complaints were filed, and some theaters pulled the movie from their schedules. In reality, Anne Francis was never nude. She wore a carefully designed, skin-colored bodysuit. The material covered her completely from neck to legs. It was thin, seamless, and fitted closely to her body. The goal was not to show skin, but to suggest a futuristic sense of freedom and calm. The costume itself broke no rules. The problem was how real it looked on screen. That effect came from the work of cinematographer George Folsey. He used very controlled lighting to remove shadows that would reveal the suit's edges. Light was placed so it softened outlines and avoided highlights where seams might show. The water played a major role as well. Ripples, reflections, and gentle movement blurred the surface of the costume. As Altera drifted, the bodysuit blended into her skin tone under shifting light. The result was an illusion strong enough to fool audiences and even some people on set. Outrage spread faster than clarification because the suggestion carried more weight than truth. Many viewers never questioned what they thought they saw. Once the idea of nudity took hold, it became a scandal. MGM issued public statements denying that Francis had appeared nude. They explained the costume and the filming techniques, but these denials failed to calm the reaction. The image had already formed in people's minds, and no explanation felt convincing enough to erase it. The scandal revealed how powerful implication could be in the 1950s. Nothing explicit was shown, but the possibility alone was enough to trigger moral panic. The scene didn't break rules through action. It broke them through perception. That made it more dangerous than anything clearly forbidden. In trying to push visual boundaries without crossing official lines, MGM ended up creating a moment that felt more transgressive than it actually was. The studio wanted elegance and restraint. What they got was outrage fueled by imagination. And as this reaction shows, what audiences believed they saw often mattered more than what was really there, setting the stage for even tighter control in what came next. Censored, more terrifying. Censorship is often meant to make stories safer, clearer, and less disturbing. In the case of Forbidden Planet, it did the opposite. By removing key explanations and softening direct language, censorship created gaps that made the film feel more tense and unsettling than it ever was meant to be. What audiences couldn't see or hear became far more troubling than anything shown openly. When scenes were cut, clarity disappeared. Important ideas about innocence, desire, and control were no longer stated outright. This created ambiguity, and that ambiguity invited viewers to fill in the blanks themselves. People tend to imagine worse things when they are left without guidance. Without clear explanations, moments in the film took on meanings that felt dangerous, confusing, or inappropriate, even when the original intent was structured and deliberate. This reaction fits perfectly into the atmosphere of 1950s America. It was a time marked by strict moral rules and deep anxiety about desirability. Public conversations about desire were limited, especially when women were involved. Anything that hinted at this awareness, without clearly explaining it, became a source of fear. When censorship removed context, it left behind emotional signals without explanation, which made audiences uncomfortable. Suggestion proved more threatening than nudity because it allowed the mind to work freely. A clearly explained scene could be judged and dismissed. A half-explained one lingered. Viewers weren't reacting to what was shown. They were reacting to what they thought might be implied. That uncertainty made scenes feel more intense and more memorable. This is where the paradox of censorship becomes clear. By trying to erase certain ideas, censorship actually sharpened them. The removed dialogue didn't disappear from the story's structure. Its absence made it louder. Symbols became heavier because nothing balanced them. The tiger attack, the swimming scene, and Altera's emotional shifts all carried more weight than intended because the reasoning behind them was hidden. As a result, Forbidden Planet became more unsettling than it would have been if it had been allowed to speak plainly. The film felt loaded with meaning that no one would fully explain. That tension stayed with viewers long after the movie ended. Instead of feeling resolved, the story felt disturbed, as if something important had been buried just out of reach. In trying to protect audiences, censorship unintentionally made the film more powerful and more controversial. The silence around certain ideas gave them strength instead of removing them. And once that silence is noticed, the next changes made to the film start to feel even more deliberate and revealing. Global fear cuts. By the early 1970s, MGM believed Forbidden Planet could reach a new audience: children. The studio wanted to rebrand the film as a family-friendly experience, suitable for kiddie matinees. To achieve this, several key edits were made, reshaping the story for younger viewers. The swimming scene, already controversial in 1956, was removed entirely. Any flirtation or subtle tension between Altera and Commander Adams was cut. Even moments of narrative suspense and psychological tension were trimmed. The goal was clear: make the film safe, inoffensive, and easily digestible. However, these changes came at a cost. The G-rated version hollowed out much of the story's depth. Without the swimming scene, the earlier controversy about perception versus reality was erased, but so was the sense of Altera's independence and symbolic power. Removing flirtation and tension diminished the psychological stakes. Scenes that once hinted at desire, control, and transformation were gone, leaving only surface-level interactions. The tiger's behavior, once explained through Altera's innocence, now seemed more confusing than ever. A generation of children grew up on this incomplete version, unaware of the film's original richness and the layers of meaning that had been excised. Meanwhile, international censorship added another layer of restriction. In Spain, under Franco's regime, the film was banned for over a decade. Authorities focused not on monsters or science fiction elements, but on clothing. Skirts, silhouettes, and exposed legs were considered dangerous, far more so than alien threats or advanced technology. Spanish censors deemed the visual presentation of women too provocative for public viewing. The result was a complete absence of the film in Spanish cinemas until 1967, long after it had already achieved classic status elsewhere. Ironically, these acts of fear and control ended up aging worse than the film itself. The G-rated version lacked the subtlety, intelligence, and psychological depth that made Forbidden Planet remarkable. By the time the original version resurfaced in restored releases, audiences could see how much had been lost. Similarly, Spain's censorship emphasized arbitrary rules rather than the story's actual content, highlighting more about the regime's anxieties than about the movie's themes. Together, these interventions show how fear and caution reshaped the film across different contexts. Where MGM tried to make the movie child-friendly, Franco-era authorities sought to eliminate perceived moral threats. Both altered how audiences experienced the story, often at the expense of coherence and meaning. And once you see how global fear rewrote the story, the next layer starts to come into focus. Altera's hidden power. Altera in Forbidden Planet is far more than a charming young woman on a distant planet. She functions as a walking metaphor for innocence, desire, and psychological influence. Her purity is both a source of power and a point of vulnerability. It allows her to control the tiger and navigate the alien environment with authority. Yet it also exposes her to consequences she does not fully understand. When she experiences the awakening of her senses, particularly through her growing feelings for Commander Adams, the psychological balance that governed her interactions is disrupted. This awakening destabilizes the environment around her, producing changes that ripple through the narrative and ultimately affect Morbius and the ID Monster. The ID Monster, the invisible, terrifying force that haunts the crew, reacts almost exclusively to Altera. This is because it is not a traditional antagonist, but a physical manifestation of Dr. Morbius's subconscious. Altera's presence, her innocence, and later her emotional shifts act as catalysts for the monster. As she changes, so does Morbius's inner world, and the monster becomes more active and dangerous. It is not a random threat. It is the subconscious made visible, responding to her symbolic and emotional role at the story's center. Joshua Meador's animation of the id monster reinforced this psychological dimension. Rather than giving it a solid form, he created a moving outline that suggested presence and movement without defining the creature fully. This technique made the monster more unsettling, as the audience had to imagine its complete form. State censors were particularly uneasy about this invisible threat because it represented ideas, fear, desire, and repression rather than tangible imagery. It challenged the limits of what could be shown on screen and made the unseen more disturbing than any physical monster could be. Altera's character shows that Forbidden Planet is as much about human psychology and the dangers of the subconscious as it is about space travel or alien worlds. And once you see her as the story's central metaphor, the interactions between Morbius, the monster, and the crew fall into clear, fascinating patterns. Mind-made monster. The Krell machine in Forbidden Planet is more than a plot device. It acts as a psychological mirror, reflecting the deepest thoughts and impulses of its user. It reads Morbius's mind, including the desires and fears he keeps buried. Intelligence without restraint becomes catastrophic. The Krell's power is limitless, yet it lacks any moral or ethical filter. As a result, Morbius's subconscious thoughts are turned into physical reality, creating the id monster. This reveals the danger of unrestrained intellect paired with unacknowledged impulses. Morbius spends most of the film in denial. He believes he has complete control over the machine and that his scientific genius has tamed it. But the machine exposes what he cannot admit to himself. His jealousy, fear, and possessiveness manifest through the id monster. It targets those around him, especially Altera, in response to her innocence and awakening of desires. Weapons fail against it because it is not a physical enemy. It is part of Morbius's own mind. When the crew tries to fight it, they are essentially fighting Morbius's repressed desires. Even Robbie the robot freezes, caught between ethical rules and instinctual logic. He cannot harm the creature without harming his master, highlighting a conflict between obedience and survival. The film also presents an unspoken incestuous subtext. Morbius' possessiveness over his daughter is never articulated openly due to 1950s Hollywood restrictions. The kiss between Altera and Commander Adams acts as a psychological rupture. It triggers the id monster, symbolizing the collapse of control and the confrontation with suppressed emotion. Morbius ultimately dies by his own creation, the very force born from the parts of himself he refused to face. The unedited scene clarifies everything. It shows that what looks like a narrative mistake, a blooper, is actually a carefully constructed psychological moment. It was never a casual error. It was the key MGM tried to bury, a clear depiction of innocence, desire, repression, and consequence. Forbidden Planet isn't just a sci-fi movie from 1956. It's a layered, carefully constructed story where every detail, from the costumes to the unseen id monster, carries meaning. What many viewers once thought were mistakes or bloopers turn out to be deliberate choices shaped by censorship, psychology, and groundbreaking creativity. The missing unicorn scene, the misunderstood swimming sequence, and the id monster's invisible presence all reveal a film that was far ahead of its time, exploring human desire, fear, and the consequences of unchecked intellect. By understanding the original intent, the restored scenes, and the hidden symbolism, we can finally see Forbidden Planet as the rich, complex work it was always meant to be. It shows how much power lies in what a story doesn't say and how censorship, perception, and historical context can completely change how a film is experienced. The movie becomes more than a space adventure. It becomes a study of human psychology, morality, and imagination. If you enjoyed uncovering these hidden layers, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and click the bell so you don't miss our video on the secret stories behind classic films. You won't want to miss what we explore next.